once again, so the temperature's pretty much stuck in a rut. Weak weather front bringing some cloud to begin with across the south for the weekend. That low pressure is gradually pulling away, so hopefully high pressure will tend to build, but we keep the risk of showers once again across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Somewhat drier and brighter, but not necessarily warmer further south.
The scores are like insane.
Rolling over in his grave. It's not home runs, it's points basically. You run between the sticks.
As fighting continues in Ukraine, join our team for the latest developments.
This is how close the missile got to hitting this block of flats. The crater is about 5 meters deep.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
The whole day. And then the test match is over 5 days. It's like a 5-day match.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So it's a bit... Such horrible places like Barbados and Australia.
Where are we at?
Live from Washington, this is BBC News. A Hamas leader takes issue with an Israeli ceasefire proposal as Israel launches a new assault on central Gaza. World leaders gather in France and in the UK to mark 80 years since the D-Day invasion. And after several false starts, Boeing's Starliner rocket blasts off on its first crewed mission, carrying astronauts to the International Space Station. I'm Carl Naspin. Welcome to the program. We begin with the war in Gaza, where there have been developments both on the ground and in ceasefire negotiations. Now, the Israel Defense Forces say it carried out a deadly airstrike early on Thursday on a UN school in the central part of the Strip. They say it housed a Hamas compound. The Hamas-run media office says at least 27 people were killed and dozens who were sheltering there were injured. And on Wednesday, Israel launched a new assault in central Gaza near Deir al-Balah, the last city in the Strip that Israeli tanks had not yet entered. At least 70 people are said to have been killed, including several children. It comes as Palestinian search teams say several hundred bodies have been found in mass graves amid the ruins of Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. Israeli forces raided the hospital for a second time in March, claiming Hamas had regrouped there, something Hamas has denied. An Israeli government spokesperson said there were no civilian casualties during that operation. But the BBC has found evidence that civilians were killed. From Jerusalem, here's our Middle East correspondent Yolan Nell, and a warning, you may find her report difficult to watch.
Amid ruins that reeked of death, Palestinians poured over what was once Gaza's biggest and best equipped hospital after Israeli forces withdrew. Israel's military raid in March was the second at the site, and it was dramatically destructive. 4 mass graves containing, local search teams say, hundreds of bodies have now been dug up at Al-Shifa, prompting international calls for an investigation into possible war crimes. There are reports of suspicious finds.
We've discovered bodies of women and children and people without heads, as well as torn body parts.
Israel's military says it exhumed bodies which Palestinians had buried earlier as it searched for hostages seized by Hamas. But some of the dead were patients. Walid believes his mother Lina died of malnutrition and dehydration. Her corpse was badly decomposed.
I identified her from particular marks on her legs. She'd been wounded in November and had a toe amputated on each foot.
Israel blames any deaths of patients on natural causes, but the World Health Organization says those trapped endured horrific conditions.
During the siege, 20 patients died, and there were patients from oxygen that who couldn't get oxygen. There was not proper medication, but also the food and water. There were stories that 15 people had to share one bottle of water.
Israel's army says Palestinian gunmen were based inside Ashifa, and that over 2 weeks it killed more than 200 Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives.
Shifa has become a main terrorism command center for Hamas. The surprise action by our forces was precise and surgical.
But battles spread onto nearby streets. And here, witnesses have told us that many civilians, including entire families, were also killed by Israeli airstrikes and snipers during the Ashifa raid. A dedicated surgeon, Dr. Ahmed Al-Makadma, was one of those shot dead close to the hospital where he worked.
I'm surprised at any...
I spoke to a top British surgeon who'd helped train him.
He was not just hungry for knowledge, he was a very gentle and somebody who all of us would want to have as our sort of doctors.
Dr. Ahmed was off shift at home near Ashifa when Israeli forces returned. After 4 days under siege and a harsh interrogation by soldiers, he tried to leave Gaza City on foot with his mother Yusra. 11 days after his disappearance, his father Saeed says, we found Ahmed's decomposed body. Israel's military says it's unaware of the deaths of the surgeon and his mother. Many others are still searching for loved ones missing since the Ashifa raid. With international forensic experts unable to get to the site, Gazans are mostly focusing on finding the dead and giving them proper burials. And that adds to worries that the full truth of what happened here may never be uncovered. Yolande Knell, BBC News, Jerusalem.
The U.S. has responded to that report. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told the BBC that the Biden administration was looking into a number of incidents inside Gaza to determine whether Israel had complied with international law. Meanwhile, tensions remain high along Israel's northern border with Lebanon, raising concerns about a wider war. Several people were injured in a village in northern Israel on Wednesday after the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah flew kamikaze drones over the frontier. In response, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu threatened military action while visiting a military base near the Lebanese border.
Yesterday, the land was burning here, and I'm glad you put it out. But the ground was also on fire in Lebanon. Whoever thinks that he will hurt us and we will sit idly by is making a big mistake. We are prepared for a very strong action in the north. One way or another, we will restore security to the north.
Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said there would be no pause in fighting while negotiations over a ceasefire proposal continue. Now, those talks remain mostly stalled. A Hamas leader said Wednesday that the group wants a permanent end to hostilities and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza as part of any ceasefire plan. Now, this demand from Hamas contrasts with last week's proposal announced by U.S. President Joe Biden, which includes an initial temporary ceasefire. Washington is still pushing for an agreement between Israel and Hamas. CIA Director William Burns met senior officials from mediators Qatar and Egypt on Wednesday in the Qatari capital, Doha. As those negotiations continue, I spoke with Laura Blumenfeld. She previously served as a senior policy advisor on the U.S. State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team.
If we're being honest, there's never going to be a real permanent ceasefire because there's a state of permanent war between Israel and Hamas. There are a few key problems, though. First of all, it's a three-part plan, as one seasoned negotiator said, in the Middle East, the only plans that work are one-part plans. This is usually negotiations are a matter of a pain-gain trade-off. But here, the pain we're talking about is pain of death. For Netanyahu, it's political death, and for Sinwar, it's literal.
Meanwhile, thousands of nationalist Israelis marched through parts of occupied East Jerusalem on Wednesday in their annual Jerusalem Day Parade. The march celebrates the capture and occupation of East Jerusalem in the 1967 war. For more, our Middle East correspondent Hugo Bachega sent us this update.
Thousands of people came here to the old city of Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Day celebration and the Flag March. This is a controversial celebration here to mark the capture of East Jerusalem by Israel in the 1967 war. There were some anti-Arab slogans being chanted by the crowds here. Police say some people were arrested after throwing bottles of water at journalists, but we didn't have any major incidents during the march. There was a very heavy police presence here with 3,000 officers deployed. Obviously, this is a very controversial event. Sometimes things turn violent here. The fact that this march goes through the Muslim quarter of the old city is seen by many as a provocation. And this year, tensions were higher because of the war in Gaza. This was the first celebration that happened after the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October. But again, there haven't been reports of major incidents during the march.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's take a look now at another story making headlines. Wales First Minister Vaughan Gething has vowed to carry on after losing a confidence vote in the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, just 77 days after he took office. The Welsh Conservatives forced the vote after months of scrutiny of donations to Mr Gething's recent leadership campaign. The vote is not binding, and he is not obligated to resign, but it leaves him under significant pressure. Mr Gething insists that he can still do the job.
I am going to carry on doing my duty. I am fiercely proud to be the First Minister of Wales and to have the opportunity to serve and lead my country.
Mr Gething won the Welsh Labour leadership back in March, earning him the First Minister post, but it didn't stop questions within his own party over a £200,000 donation he accepted from a company whose owner had convictions for illegally dumping waste. Mr Gething denies any wrongdoing. He described the no-confidence vote as a desperate gimmick staged by campaigning Conservatives. But the Welsh Conservative Senedd leader said he had lost the confidence in the people of Wales. You're live with BBC News. The King, Queen and Prince of Wales have joined World War II veterans to mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day. The 6th of June, 1944, was the day that British, American, Canadian and French troops landed on Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah beaches, taking the Germans by surprise in what was the largest ever amphibious invasion. It changed the course of World War II. Commemorative events have taken place both in France and in the UK, including a vigil in Bayeux. The Princess Royal paid tributes to D-Day veterans as they gathered in Normandy to remember fallen colleagues and their own efforts. A minute's silence was observed in remembrance of the fallen. My colleague Sophie Rayworth spoke to one veteran, 98-year-old Roy Harrison, who served with the Royal Navy. He reflected on his experience of that day in 1944.
Well, just all these memories of D-Day and all the men in the water, swimming, sinking, scrambling ashore in the sands, Juno Beach. And all we could do was watch, and that was my regret anyway. I couldn't help them.
You came here, didn't you, for the first time?
Yes.
5 years ago. And you didn't
No.
really talk about D-Day, did you?
I never talked about anything, no.
Why not?
Because I'd just get too emotional, and I didn't want to see my family. I never spoke to them about it.
We're here at a service for the fallen, aren't we? What is that like for you to be
Proud
here?
to think I was here. Yes, it's an honour. I just wish, especially those in the Middle East, if they think twice. Talk peace and not war.
To mark D-Day on Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden will be in Normandy along many world leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, reports.
Les Américains, the Americans, are back in town. And it's feeling like the 1940s. From all over Europe, the young and a little less young, clad in World War II Allied military uniforms, celebrating and commemorating soldiers who landed here on D-Day. to liberate Nazi-occupied France. These men changed the course of history. 99-year-old Donald Cobb's modesty is humbling.
I don't feel like a hero. I mean, we just did what we were told. And I'm happy that we were able to help.
80 years on, they are still huge heroes here.
That it is really a lot of emotion for me.
Brave French men and women played their part in D-Day too. Catherine's father and brother were members of the resistance. This street now named after them.
The Allies needed details on German military positions. My young brother gathered intelligence for them.
Betrayed by a neighbor, Catherine's brother and father were then sent to Nazi concentration camps. They survived, but she missed her father desperately.
The patrie, his country, is more important than his family. I think it's that. Why?
But you're proud of him?
Yes, yes, a lot. I'm very proud, yes.
Yeah. Amongst the celebrations and solemnity of the D-Day commemorations, there are also painful memories of Nazi occupation here, some collaboration, and so many lives lost. And also a realization that despite decades now of pledging never again, war has come back here to Europe on a scale not seen since World War II, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ahead of tomorrow's formal D-Day ceremonies,
a moment of liberty for us. Un moment de liberté pour nous.
We found this international youth group rehearsing for the world leaders expected here.
As a German, I wanted to send a message of peace.
Not repeat the mistake of the past.
And a plea from Ukraine.
Freedom to all of us.
A heartfelt D-Day message for leaders everywhere. Katya Adler, BBC News, Normandy.
Well, this week marks 1 year since the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine was destroyed, causing widespread flooding that killed dozens of people. The floodwaters also killed animals, swept away agriculture, and spread toxic chemicals. The Kakhovka Dam held back a reservoir that supplied water to nearby communities and to the nuclear power station in Zaporizhia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called the destruction of the dam an environmental bomb. According to a report by British researchers, about 83,000 hectares of land, an area the size of Kyiv, was flooded downstream. It also said that 567 species were affected by the hazards caused by the deluge. Of those, 28 are considered globally threatened or worse. One of those species, a bird called the slender-billed crew, is now on the verge of extinction. I spoke with Ukrainian writer and researcher Sasha Dovchik about the environmental effects of the war in Ukraine. It's actually a bit dark on your end. You're in Lviv, where I understand there are power blackouts due to the effects of Russia's war on Ukraine. It really does show. I mean, you can see the damage inflicted on many cities across the country by this war. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. But I do want to start by asking you, why then is it so important to examine the environmental impact of this conflict?
I think it is important to understand that Russia is waging its genocidal war against Ukrainian people, first and foremost, but also against the environment in Ukraine. And while people still, against all the attempts to silence them, are able to speak up, nature is a silent victim and a silent witness to this war. Since the very start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, nature has been subject to pollution through bombings, through shelling, through mining, and other effects of armed conflicts. And unfortunately, unlike us, nature has no other means to declare its rights, so we have to do it for it.
I think one example of the way that this conflict has really impacted the environment there has to be the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam back in June of last year. This was a reservoir about the same size as the Salt Lake in Utah. This really flooded a huge region. I mean, talk about the environmental impact of the destruction of that dam.
Actually, the coincidence is such that we're speaking on the 1-year anniversary of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. It happened on the 6th of June 2023, when Russians blew up the dam. The polluted water, the toxic water, flooded 80 settlements, I think. I'll have to check my notes to be precise. Yeah, it was 80 settlements. And the polluted water basically destroyed natural habitats, waterways. It was flooded into the Black Sea basin. And the human casualties are still covered up by Russia's occupational forces, and natural casualties, the casualties among those inhabitants that are non-human in the region, are yet to be counted as well.
Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of Europe. How has the conflict affected the country's farmland?
The area that was flooded as the result of the destruction of the dam is actually among the most productive, the most fecund lands in Europe. It's Ukrainian famous black soil that produces the food that feeds not only our country, but also Middle East and Africa. That production was obviously affected by the flood. It is also affected by Russia's blockade of the Black Sea, which Ukraine successfully stopped by fighting its way through the Russian blockade. And now ships from Ukraine are regularly coming to Africa and the Middle East, thanks to the heroism, basically, of the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukraine is a country with no sea fleet, but it was able to free its way through the Black Sea against Russian forces.
There's also another impact, I think, on the environment that many people may not know, but Ukraine is now believed to be the world's largest minefield. What impact do the landmines used in this conflict have, not only on people, of course, but also on the land itself?
Yeah. I regularly go on volunteer trips to the-occupied and frontline territories of Ukraine in the east and north of the country. That's the Kharkiv region, Donetsk region, as well as Chernihiv and Kyiv region of the country. These areas combined amount to the size of Austria and Hungary combined, I think, two major European countries. 1/3 of Ukrainian territory is currently covered in explosives of all kinds. And this is a huge amount of territory. And when you go through the areas that have been affected by fighting, you can see the effects on the natural landscape. That's the trees that are broken, that also are forests that become out of touch for people. You literally cannot enter the forest because wherever there is high grass, you risk your life or your leg at the very least, because the high grass can hide landmines that have been dispersed there by Russians from the air.
All right, let's take a look now at some other stories making headlines today. A Georgia appeals court has halted the Georgia election interference case against former U.S. President Donald Trump. The court is putting the case on hold until a panel of judges can review a lower court's ruling allowing Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis to remain on the case. This ruling means that the case would be unlikely to move forward before November's presidential election. Amanda Knox, the American woman who was convicted and then cleared of murdering her British roommate, has been sentenced to 3 years in prison for slander in a retrial. Ms. Knox has been convicted of falsely implicating a man in the murder of Meredith Kircher in Italy 17 years ago. Despite today's sentencing, Ms. Knox will not go to jail as she has already served 4 years for murder before being acquitted. Well, the Boeing Starliner spaceship with 2 astronauts on board is currently on its way to the International Space Station.
2, 1, ignition, and liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V.
There it goes. The spaceship launched successfully from Cape Canaveral in Florida on Wednesday on its 3rd try. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh has more.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition, and liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V. carrying 2 American heroes.
Boeing's Starliner spacecraft makes it up into the sky and on its way to the International Space Station.
Looking good with speeds and attitude increasing as expected.
On board, 2 of NASA's most experienced astronauts on the spacecraft's first test flight with a crew.
You got a good throttle up.
A view from the rocket, and we see one of the solid rocket boosters fall away.
The solid rocket boosters have now been jettisoned after seeing Starliner through its first 90 seconds of flight.
And then the main engine separates.
Got a good throttle up.
Good hard burn, going to Got one.
The spacecraft now safely in orbit.
Of course, you're seeing lots of happy faces and cheers here in Florida.
It was third time lucky for the launch, aborted twice in the past 4 weeks because of technical issues with the rocket. And this test flight has been delayed by almost a decade because of other technical problems in Starliner's development. So in the post-launch debrief, the man in charge of the mission at Boeing said today's success came as a relief.
You know, a lot of people say I need to smile more, and I'm smiling, believe me. But it's a little bit of controlled emotion because there's a lot of phases of this mission, and we just completed the first one. You know, pre-launch and launch is just the first part of this. We now have to get to ISS, we have to dock, we have to do docking ops, we have to undock, we have to do re-entry, and we have to land.
Starliner is a brand new spacecraft that sits on top of the rocket. And this is its first test flight with a crew on board. It's been built to transport crew and cargo to and from the International Space Station. It'll take around a day to get there, and the mission will last just over a week. And when it gets back to Earth, it'll be with a bump in what's going to be the first hard capsule landing for a US mission. Along with SpaceX, there'll now be 2 private sector firms taking astronauts to the space station if Boeing's test flight goes well.
Having competition with 2 providers providing NASA with a way to and from the space station should bring down costs. And that's really important for NASA and other space agencies like the European Space Agency and indeed the UK Space Agency, because we're spending taxpayers' money on these flights to get our astronauts to the space station, and we want to get the best value for money.
But regular missions to the space station will depend on there being no further serious technical issues. With so much at stake, it'll be a big week for Boeing. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
I'm Carl Nassman in Washington. We have plenty more stories coming up at the top of the hour. Stay with us right here on BBC News.
Hello there. Having just had one of the wettest and dullest springs on record, I'm sure if you got 12 hours of sunshine, you'd take it. That's exactly what we had on Wednesday through the Isle of Man. A chilly day, but a beautiful day in terms of sunshine. Slightly different story further north and west. Temperatures struggled in parts of Scotland to get up into double figures, and there was a rash of sharp showers as well. That's because Scotland and Northern Ireland, you're closest to this area of low pressure, and a brisk northwesterly wind continues to feed showers in around that low. So we start off on a chilly note. First thing on Thursday morning, sunny spells and scattered showers through Scotland and Northern Ireland, fairly widespread throughout the day. Further south, after a cloudy start, the clouds should break up, some sunshine come through. There's always a risk of 1 or 2 isolated showers across England and Wales, but hopefully they'll be few and far between. And with a little more shelter in the southeast, we could see temperatures peaking at 18 degrees. Fresher on those exposed northwest coast, only 14 degrees in Northern Ireland, cooler perhaps on the exposed north coast, and in Scotland we're looking at 10 to 14 degrees with those showers continuing on and off throughout the day. Now, as we move out of Thursday into Friday, we see more of an organised line of rain developing, but that is where that cooler air is going to sit into the far northwest. Temperatures just below par for the time of year further south, but there are indications of some warmer weather arriving over the next few days. But to start with, we're looking at single figures first thing on Friday morning in rural parts of Scotland. Low single figures not out of the question once again. And there will be some rain moving its way south and east out of Scotland, down into the north of England and North Wales. Sunny spells and a few scattered showers ahead of it. Still a rash of showers, particularly to the northwest of the Great Glen, where here temperatures will sit around 10 or 11 degrees. Further south, we're going to see highs of 18 Celsius once again. So the temperature's pretty much stuck in a rut. Weak weather front bringing some cloud to begin with across the south for the weekend. That low pressure is gradually pulling away, so hopefully high pressure will tend to build, but we keep the risk of showers once again across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Somewhat drier and brighter, but not necessarily warmer further south.
After months of speculation, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced there will be a general election on July the 4th. You can get all the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app. And stay up to date with the latest developments by watching live on bbc.co.uk. Or sign up to our daily newsletter for BBC News direct to your inbox. Follow the story of the general election with BBC News.
Yeah.